Futures in Fundraising is presented by Alexander Haas. Alexander Haas, transforming institutions that transform lives.
Welcome, everyone, to Futures in Fundraising. I'm David King, president of Alexander Haas, your host today. Today we have Ted Bilich. He is the Chief Executive Officer of Risk Alternatives out of Arlington, Virginia. Welcome to Futures in Fundraising, Ted.
David, thanks for having me here. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Great. Well, I was wondering if you could start out by telling us a little bit about Risk Alternatives, what it is you guys do, and who you serve.
Absolutely. We started Risk Alternatives about 5 years ago in the DC metro area. Our idea is the best way to build strong communities is to build strong nonprofits and strong startup businesses. And I come out of a background in law.
I'm sorry.
I know. I'm a recovering lawyer. I'm a recovering attorney. But I came out of a background in law and then law teaching. And when I left teaching, what I wanted to do, David, was to help organizations avoid breaking eggs in the first place so that they wouldn't have to have lawyers. And you help organizations avoid breaking eggs, create resiliency by helping them establish the basics of risk management and also the basics of process improvement. And that's what we do with our customers.
Mm-hmm. Are most of your customers nonprofit, or you work with nonprofits and for-profits?
Most of our customers are nonprofits, and an increasing number of organizations are for-profit organizations that are in an inflection point where they may be 5 years away from either wanting to sell their business, or they've reached some other inflection point that makes them say, we need to professionalize so that when others look to us, we can put out a face that says we're worth a multiple.
Right. So I want to ask you, if you would, for us to talk about, you talk a lot about risk management. And when I think of risk management, I think of it as insurance,
Right.
But I think you're defining it somewhat differently than that, if I understand correctly. So if you would, talk to us about what risk management means in the work that you do.
Absolutely, David. And your instinct that risk management means insurance is a common one in the nonprofit sector. In the business world, especially in the last 15 years ago or so, risk management has begun to mean something significantly different. Mm-hmm. Risk management means simply dealing with uncertainty in the workplace. Risk is not a bad thing. Risk simply means we don't know exactly what's going to happen next. Risk can be either good, which would be an opportunity, or bad, and we would call those threats. A risk management process, therefore, is simply a routine of identifying threats and opportunities as a regular part of business operations and dealing with them on the front end rather than dealing with them once they become crises.
Okay. So I would imagine that takes the form of everything from having good and necessary written policies for workplace behavior and other things, and then all the way up to how you would handle, how you are insured and covered in the event that something goes askew.
Exactly right. You can do lots of things to a risk. You can research that risk to get to the bottom of it. You can avoid it by having policies and procedures that say we'll not do that kind of thing. You can mitigate it by saying we have to do this, but we're going to do it in a better way. You can shift the risk, and that's where insurance comes in. You can shift the risk to someone else through insurance, but not just insurance. It could be joint ventures or changing your contract provisions. There are lots of things to do with risks. And if a nonprofit can get to the point where it is, as a matter of course, looking at threats and opportunities, getting its team to look at threats and opportunities, and doing that over and over again, they have a risk management process.
Great. So I want to, maybe this question might get us deeper into the weeds than we want to be, but in order to do a risk assessment on one of your clients, it seems like you have to get pretty deep into the organization and and really look at not just a high level of how they're operating, but almost down to what risky behaviors are individuals doing. What is your process for evaluating the amount of risk an organization is taking that I'm guessing they're not even aware of?
It's a great question, and the answer is ultimately the client itself is the expert on the threats and opportunities it faces, but it often doesn't know that. And so working in a risk inventory process, that idea of pulling risks out, is almost a therapy process. We have a tool that we use where we do training, and then we have a core group of senior leadership take an online survey to identify threats and opportunities across 10 or 11 different functions, operations, IT, talent management, risk management, compliance, sales, because nonprofits are engaged in sales, even if they think they're not, lots of different things. And then after they do that inventory, then we work with them to boil that inventory down to the core set of risks that are most important to the organization right now. Of course, one of the things we do during that process, David, is to the extent that we see something that should be on their radar that isn't on their radar, we make sure that we raise that as well.
Sure. And I assume part of the outcome of this too is not just let's try, we're as you've defined it, we're all taking risks all the time, and we hope that those risks move us in a positive direction, but sometimes risks we're taking that we may not even be aware of move us in a bad direction. So does your work also include contingency plans? Like we're trying to avoid this, but if we can't, here's what we're going to do about it?
Absolutely. One of the things you want to do is you can't predict the future. That's silly. But what you can do is you can be more aware in the present of possible futures, so that when those things do arise, you're already prepared for it. If you have a basic script for what happens when the New York Times calls you, it doesn't matter what it is that they're calling you about. If the New York Times calls you and they want to ask you about X, if you have a basic script about who's going to handle that and what your first words out of your mouth are going to be, you are going to be so much better in that conversation.
Yeah. Crisis management. We talk about that with clients. What do you do when 60 minutes knocks on the door?
Absolutely.
Slamming it in their face usually isn't the right outcome.
No. It doesn't really work well for them or you.
So I was wondering if in that work, if there is a thing or maybe a couple of things that you see that are risks that most nonprofits have that they may not be aware of. Are there some common things that you walk in and sort of everybody is just, it's over here, but nobody's paying any attention to it?
Absolutely. And one of them would have to do, we could talk about it within the theme of fundraising, or we could talk about it more broadly. And that is, there is so much knowledge, David, that is captured in the brains of senior leadership, but not documented in basic policies and procedures in a nonprofit. And I'm not just talking about your $500,000 nonprofit. I'm talking about your $15, $20, $40 million nonprofits with a CEO. That CEO tends to be walking around with operational procedures in her brain that simply aren't captured as SOPs for the organization. That is an enormous risk, because as we all know, most senior leadership in nonprofits these days are baby boomers, and baby boomers are reaching retirement age. And so you're going to risk a real brain drain in terms of information if you don't start capturing that data, not in 50-page books, but in 2- and 3-page books, 2- and 3-page memos about this is our way of doing X and Y and Z.
So we did a process at our firm a couple of years ago. There was no imminent thing happening that I know of, but where we went through and took everything that I do on a daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly basis, and first just made a bulleted list. Here are all the things that I, as the president of the company, do. And then I have 3 other partners, handed that list out to 3 other partners and said, everybody put their name by the things on here that if something happened to me unexpectedly, you think you could take over, at least on an interim basis, until I was replaced. And so we sort of got them segmented out so that there was a plan. And then the other part, which was somewhat painful on my end, was then I had to go through each one of those tasks and document how the task gets done, so that these people who signed up for it but don't do it on a daily basis, if I got hit by a truck, they could come in and go, all right, here's how we do this, and have a list of it, so that they could walk through it. And some of it is rather mundane and some of it is rather complex. But that sort of contingency plan, just, what if,
Right.
The hard part about that is some of those processes change. And you have to continuously go back to that document and this has changed. We use a different vendor for this now, or whatever the case may be.
Right. Now, when I talk to organizations about that, first of all, as a smaller business, having gone through that, you are so far ahead of the game because most organizations have not done that. But the second thing is there are some really good online tools, guidance that you can find. And I can certainly give you a couple of sites for your show notes for this show of really good summaries of, let's say you want to document your processes in your company in 1 year. How do you do that and not be intimidated? There's a really nice article about that, for instance. And there are also a couple of online tools. One's called Suite Process, and another is one that I use called Process Street, that allows you to create those sorts of online checklists and give them out to your team and have them automatically be able to go through those checklists. You get to see that as feedback as the boss, so that you know that those processes are being done, and yet you're not having to repeat yourself all the time. So there are some nice tools to help, but the process itself can be challenging.
I'm afraid we were a little more old school than that, like legal pad and pen, than in a Word document.
You can't beat it sometimes.
So after I went through that process, one of the things that I did is I went to everybody in the firm and gave them a legal pad, literally, and said, everything you do, I want you to write down the steps that you do it. If it's something you do every day, then one day write it down. If it's something you do once a month, when it comes time to do it the next time, write it down. If it's something you do once a quarter, when it comes time, write it down. If it's something you do once a year, then the next time you do it, write it down. And at the end of a year, we're going to have a process manual for everything that you do. And so I was able to get people to do that, but their worry was that I was doing that to replace them. So
And to get people, the mind flow of process improvement is, we're not trying to do more with less, and we're not trying to replace you. What we're trying to do is we're trying to honor your expertise, and we're trying to capture that expertise so that we get a baseline of how things should be done now, so that then you can help us figure out how they can be done better moving forward. And as soon as you can get people to have that change of mind frame, all of a sudden you open up a whole lot of value within your organization.
Well, and you get better employee engagement too, because
without question.
All right, we're going to take a really short break. We've got a good start here, some good conversation about risk management and risk assessment, and we will be right back in a minute with more with Ted Bilich.
The biggest influence for me in my life is my father, Ted Taylor, who's still with us, thankfully. He was the chairman and president of the Kresge Foundation for roughly 20 years, starting back in the mid-1970s. He took me with him on his visits to potential donees when they approached the Kresge Foundation for a grant. He, as the president, would take it upon himself to go visit as many of the potential grantees to see the kind of work they were doing. And that affected me in a significant way that I never really appreciated until some 20 years later when I decided to get involved on the philanthropy side of the house. So Dad still is my go-to person when it comes to what energizes me in this particular field.
Welcome back to Futures in Fundraising. Our guest today is Ted Bilich, who runs the firm Risk Alternatives, helping nonprofit organizations manage all kinds of risk. We've had some great conversation about what that risk looks like and some ways to mitigate it. I wanted to pivot a little bit, Ted, and ask you about some research that you guys have done. You talked with, it looks like over 100 foundations about risk and how they I guess, consider risk when making funding decisions. So I wonder if you could walk us through that process, those conversations, what you learned, and if there are any big aha takeaways that our audience might get from that research. Absolutely.
The research started right around the time of the last election cycle. And I wouldn't be surprised if it had, if the success of the research had something to do with how that election cycle unsettled the nonprofit sector. But we had decided to reach out to a few foundations to get their views of what they saw their grantees doing with respect to risks, how worried they were about risk management within the nonprofit community, and what they felt nonprofits should be doing about these issues. We sent out cold emails to about 300 or 400 foundations, expecting that we would get about 30 responses.
Yeah, which you'd have been thrilled with, right? 10% response rate, awesome.
Instead, we got more than 150 responses. Wow. Those ended up with more than 110 interviews. And these were not short interviews. These were me and the CEO or CFO or COO or the program director of some of the largest foundations in the United States and some of the smallest ones. Mm-hmm. And we asked them a course of questions about what they felt about nonprofit risks, and we were really surprised by the findings. The first one was they don't really know what nonprofits are doing about the risks that the nonprofits are facing. But they worry, these foundations worry that nonprofits are not doing enough to manage uncertainty. And so time and time again, what we heard were themes like, we know that nonprofits have been faced with years of being pecked to death by ducks. They are so worried about their overhead that they're not going to spend on infrastructure. We know that because of the starvation cycle, nonprofits are rarely going to put money into something basic like risk management when some child is going to be hungry as a result of that. We know that there's a culture of scarcity in the nonprofit sector that makes nonprofits think that looking under rocks is a scary thing to do because they already know that they have a lot of threats out there. So why should they look for more? And so the themes that we heard were, number one, we don't know what they're doing. Number two, we're increasingly worried about what they're doing. And then the third one was, and number three, some of us are actually interested in helping nonprofits go down that path. If a nonprofit comes to us and says, we would like some support because we would like to go through the basics of risk management, we're going to be receptive to that sort of infrastructure capacity building funding. And so I thought that was a very encouraging message to come out of that research from the nonprofits perspective.
Do you think it did anything to change the foundation's own internal behavioral processes, maybe asking new or different or better questions about risk before they make grants or as part of the process?
I think there are a number of major foundations that are going through that very process right now. They are trying to figure out how they train their program employees to ask questions that are not just about the 990, but are about the operational challenges and operational opportunities facing the potential grantee. I know that is a dialogue that is going on at a number of really forward-looking foundations right now.
I would imagine that conversation is very tense in its beginning.
Yes.
With the organization saying, why are you asking me about these things?
Well, and indeed, it's tense even one step up the process, David, which is when I was speaking to many of these foundations, even some of the very large, very sophisticated private foundations in the United States and major community foundations, one of the responses that I got from candid CEOs and CFOs was risk management. We don't have a risk management program. And so, perhaps we need to be looking in the mirror.
Yes, physician, heal thyself, right?
Yes, to trying to decide for ourselves what the language of risk management means to a sophisticated foundation so that we can in turn turn around and have that same sort of discussion with our grantee community.
Yeah. I think, you touched on this a little bit. One of the great disservices that has been done to the nonprofit sector is these sort of watchdog groups over emphasizing, what is and isn't overhead in an organization.
Yes.
I wrote an article last week or 2 weeks ago for Forbes that touched on this a little bit. Basically trying to make the argument that having an experienced quality CEO in a nonprofit organization is not overhead.
No.
That a for-profit business would consider investing in a quality CEO to be critical to success.
Absolutely.
Not overhead. Likewise, investing in a for-profit model, a great vice president of sales, and in a nonprofit sector, a great VP or director of development is also not overhead. No sales, no revenue, no company, no development work, no revenue, no nonprofit. But we've allowed these people sort of on the outside to cast anything that doesn't directly touch one of the constituents as overhead, when some of those are core, fundamental things that you need to do and do well to run a successful business, whether it's a for-profit business or a not-for-profit business.
Absolutely, David. I could not agree with you more. And it is remarkable in my experience. I've served on many different boards. I've advised scores of nonprofit boards. Board members tend to be very strongly committed to mission. It is remarkable to me how often they check their business hats at the door.
Yep.
As far as being able to contend that the nonprofit should be run on a shoestring, whereas their SG&A in their own business is probably 30 to 45%, yep. And they feel very comfortable with that. In fact, they'd be shocked if it went any lower. Yep. And so there's a real disconnect there that is pervasive. And I'm not sure what to do about it. And maybe if you and I and everyone else jump up and down enough about it, we'll finally get some people focused on this. But an effective nonprofit is generally going to be a nonprofit that has a substantial infrastructure investment within it so that it can be effective.
Yeah, I think, these organizations some of them are trying to tackle really huge issues, really huge problems, and they're trying to do it on a shoestring budget with the talent they can afford, which means not the best talent they could get.
Right.
So it creates sort of, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy at that point. You're never going to fix this because you're not putting the resources into the structure that you would need to fix it.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And you see that so often, well, in the fundraising function
Absolutely. That's where I see
where
it all the time.
you have an executive director who is being asked to do a significant amount of fundraising, which is different than what a CEO in a corporation tends to be doing. You have a director of development who nowadays probably has a tenure of 14 months, perhaps. I think that's what the national
It
average
keeps
is.
going down.
It keeps going down because they're in real demand. And yet, because there's that 14-month cycle through, there's very little documentation of the function, and there's very little training about what is our way of taking people from outside the funnel down through the funnel, through to become successful donors, and then to become evangelists for us in the community. There's almost no documentation, even in $30 million organizations, let alone the $1.5 million organization that we often face.
And I attribute a lot of that turnover as a self-inflicted wound in the sector, because organizations tend to not value the person they have who's doing a good job as much as the organization across the street does. So
Yep.
the organization across the street will come and offer this person 20% more than they're making to come across the street, but the organization they're with is telling them they're capped at a 3% pay raise because that's policy. And so they
Yes.
leave. And then the organization they left ends up having to pay a new person what they would have paid that person to get them to come. The dollars
Right.
all wash out, but you've lost a good person who had relationships in the process.
Absolutely. And so if there were a way that again, nonprofits could think about compensation, especially in the development function, to capture a good person, and capture a good person long enough that person can institutionalize a methodology that is not person specific.
Yeah.
Boy, that can really help.
Yeah, I'm afraid that the sort of cultural belief that everybody who works in a nonprofit should be doing it as a sacrificial, almost calling or mission.
Yes.
I mean, it pervades all the way down from the federal government, where the last tax bill is putting an excise tax on nonprofit executives who make more than $1 million a year. Now, that's a lot of money. I get it, but if you look at, for example, some of the largest universities in this country, those presidents are actually the CEO of a $200 or $300 million a year business.
Right.
And if you want to recruit somebody who can run a $300 million a year business, they're going to expect to be compensated that way.
Of course. And mission only goes so far. Mission is critical, of course, and mission is why so many people go into the sector. But oftentimes those missions are very challenging missions, and they're missions that if you actually accomplish it, you're going to put yourself out of business. So there has to be something more than just mission that brings a nonprofit employee in and keeps her in for an extended period of time. It has to be that you are treating that employee with, well, giving them a safe, happy work environment, and giving them some compensation that allows them to feel that they are valued not only by the organization, but relative to what else they could get out in the marketplace.
I have a friend who does a lot of marketing work around mission, vision, values, and he always talks about the vision for your organization has to be something that you probably will never achieve. And the example he uses in that is the March of Dimes, the original mission to cure polio. We did it. Now what?
Yeah.
So they had to do a complete rethinking of, well, what do we do now? We have this infrastructure. We obviously know what we're doing. We're good at it. We cured polio, or we were part of the cure for polio. Now what? So they came back with I think he may have worked with them on this. They came back with a new vision that is unachievable, but they want to work toward forever, which is that every child be born healthy.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're right about that. You can put yourself out of business if your vision is too easy to get a grasp on.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you one more thing in the time we have left, and I know, you feel like nonprofits have a particularly risky business model, even compared to their for-profit cousins of similar scale. And I wanted to ask you, what is it about the nonprofit business model that makes it so risky?
Well, if you think about it, David, imagine if you came to a venture capitalist and you said you wanted to have the following elements of a business model. You're going to have a volunteer board of directors. You're not going to compensate those board of directors for their showing up. You're going to work with populations who are themselves risky. Rarely is someone coming in the door of a nonprofit because it's the best day of their life. Sometimes you're working with people who may present challenges that society frowns on, either drug addiction or something like that. Yeah. So you're dealing with risky and stressful populations. You're going to underpay all of the people who work for you. You're going to have an aggressive mission, the success of which would put you out of business. Now, if you presented that to a venture capitalist, and also you're going to use volunteers to run some of your operations, which means that you're not going to be able to fire some of the people who work in frontline positions for you. And you're going to have to, in some ways, coddle them because they are ambassadors out to the community for you. You put that together, and you have the single worst business model you could possibly have. And yet, that's a description in a nutshell of the average social service nonprofit.
Yeah. Very interesting. Well, Ted, how can people in our audience find you if they want to do a risk assessment of the nonprofit they're involved with?
Well, the best way to find me is I'm on Twitter. My handle is @tbilich. They can also send me an email directly, which would be at tedbilich, all one word, TEDBILICH, @risk-alternatives.com. If they wanted to do things on their own, though, David, they could also go to Risk Alternatives, our website, and they could download. There are materials like a do-it-yourself risk inventory, so that they could take the first step of risk management themselves. And there are other items that they could find where they would be able to do it on their own and still become more resilient and risk-aware and more organizationally sound.
Fantastic. Ted, I want to thank you for joining us today. It's been great to have you on here. A lot of good food for thought. This is a unique topic for us on Futures in Fundraising. We really haven't covered the risk aspect before. So this was a really good conversation. I appreciate you being on today. And I hope everyone will tune in next time for more Futures in Fundraising.